Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to be looking at Does Linux Suck 2021, and this is in response to Brian Lunduke. Right after this. Yeah, so I think it was in June, mid-June or something, that Brian came out with he does these annually, and he has for quite some time, that Linux sucks. And this one was entitled The End of Linux is Nigh. Such a clickbait title. But I wanted to take a look at it and do a little bit of replying of my own in this topic. So let's talk about his credentials. So he had this whole list of credentials that he talked about, and he said that you couldn't reply to his video unless you matched his credentials. Okay, yeah, well, I won't dispute his credentials. He's certainly a well-known Linux figure. I am not a well-known Linux figure, but I have been involved in both the Unix community way before Linux, and then in the Linux open source community. I have been for a number of years. So I have been a developer. I have been a manager. I have been an architect, both for corporations and for operating system companies. So I understand I understand this area pretty well. Whether or not you want to claim me as an expert, that's up to you. But I don't really consider myself an expert, just somebody who's experienced. So yeah, the first thing he talked about is the Linux leadership is under attack. Richard Stallman is out of the free software, is what he had said. Richard Stallman has since been returned as a voting board member. He is not in the same position that he was when he left or was forced out of the FSF, but he is back and has been since April of 2021. Eric Raymond was banned from the Open Source Initiative. That's an initiative that Eric did start, and yes, indeed, he is. And I think that has more to do with his political views than it does with his controversies that have happened over the years with the OSI. Linux Torvald was given some time off to attend sensitivity training, so he's been kind of under attack too. A lot of people criticize Linus because he's not very nice to people, but I don't know too many software developers that are that started out that way. But he is still actively involved in the Linux kernel development. I don't believe he does any coding anymore, and my reply to this whole thing is, so what? No one person should be the linchpin for the success or failure of an operating system. It should be faceless. That's my opinion, and it always has been all through the years. So yes, I agree with him that the leadership is under attack, but I think my real concern in this area is that free and open source, the way it's defined by the SFS, is more under attack than anything else, and that is a threat, period. The trend right now is to limit the license of open source to companies that are doing their business according to a preset set of rules determined by this group of people who've appointed themselves as judge, jury, and advocate for the entire world on how we conduct ourselves. And that has never been the intent of free and open source. It's no longer free and open source if you do that. Now you're imposing limitations on the license, and no, that's not free and open source. Sorry. The biggest companies are undergoing dramatic changes. Yes, indeed. We saw that with Red Hat. IBM has purchased them. Now, in the past, when I was involved with IBM, typically the purchases of a company would undergo what IBM calls blue washing. Blue washing is when a company is rebranded under the IBM marketing logos and brand and appears as part of the IBM solution set and not as a standalone entity. And in the past, many companies have been crushed out of existence by IBM for a number of reasons. IBM is very competitive internally. So if you have a good idea, you'll probably find competition within the company for that same idea. That has always been their mantra and always been the way they go to business. they feel that that gives them a stronger product in the long run. They allow the business units to compete. So, so far, however, IBM has not shown any movement along the line of their traditional blue wash. So, Red Hat is remaining to, it seems, to be able to function independently, although the debacle with CentOS could be indicative of IBM pressuring them to get rid of a competitor that they would view as a competitor in the marketplace to selling licenses on Linux. And IBM definitely would look at it that way. They look at what is competing with their software product, and if it is something they control, then they will eliminate it. SUSE gets sold every third Thursday. That's pretty funny. Yes, SUSE has been under the control of many different organizations over its lifetime. And again, they're saying that, he's saying that they're just not focusing on Linux anymore. They're focusing more on technologies like Docker and other forms of virtualization, microservices, and all of those things that are built in Kubernetes and all that stuff. So, my opinion on that is, who cares? Operating systems, in my experience, have never been the reason why somebody purchases a technology. It is the application stack, it's the application, it's the solution set that meets the needs and desires of a company. And that is also true for us who use Linux at home. The reason we use a particular distribution of Linux is because it's better suited to a set of tasks that we're trying to accomplish, or we don't use Linux, we use something else because it's better suited to accomplishing those tasks, whether that be Windows, whether that be Mac OS. There's a lot of people in the Linux community that feel that if you're using Mac OS or Windows, well, you're a failure. And I don't look at it that way. I don't look at corporations that way either. If a corporation is using Windows or using Mac OS to accomplish a task, that's really the end game, right? Yeah, I understand that there's a lot of issues with using those other two platforms that are closed, but I don't base my decisions on what applications I run based on whether they're free and open source or not. There's a number of applications, even under the Linux banner, which are not free and open source. And in fact, I don't think any of the current distributions that are popular even meet the guidelines of the FSF. I mean, if you go out to their pages, there probably is a handful of Linux distributions that you probably never have heard of that do meet their strict guidelines for free and open source. But even the main bellwethers like Red Hat, SUSE, Debian, Ubuntu, even Arch don't meet it. So yeah, you won't find those on the list of the approved operating system distros by the Free Software Foundation. So who cares, honestly? The Linux Journal was killed off by its parent company. Again, so what? That's been the trend anyway in the traditional media outlets. Come on, Brian, where you been? I mean, this is the 21st century, not the 20th century. We don't rely on traditional media anymore for getting our news out to our users. Even Brian uses YouTube, Odyssey, but it's still a social network in order to get the information out to you. So yeah, its demise is probably more indicative of the marketplace than it is Linux. There have been a lot of magazines that have met that same fate, whether they be car, motorcycle, housing, whatever, architecture. So then he talks about the Linux complexity is increasing rapidly. Talks about almost 2 million lines of code added per year to the Linux kernel, and that's excluding all of the other applications that are included with a typical distro. I don't know if 2 million lines are correct or not. I've conducted my own Slack counts. Slack is one of those things where you can put 50 people in a room and you'll get 51 definitions for Slack. That's a difficult count to make, whether or not it's 2 million, 1 million, 500,000, who knows. And honestly, who cares? I mean, all software has entropy, which increases from simplicity to complexity over time until at some point it's dumped, rewritten, and and then refactored into a more efficient vein of software. I think what I mean, I think his point is really more to Linux needs to be streamlined again. It needs to be refactored and repackaged into a smaller, tighter, faster version of it. So, yes, there's a lot of drivers that are still in that kernel. But as you saw the past few years when Linus dropped the 32-bit support out of the Linux kernel, there was an uproar in the community. Oh my God, we have to have this, we have to have this. So anytime you try to throw something away, there will always be somebody there that says, no, got to have it. So it's the reason why it's still there. Nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to unleash that dragon. So, yeah, it's going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to grow at whatever rate it actually is. Numerous complexity features such as Intel Software Guard extension enclaves have been added. SGX, which is what it's formerly called, is nothing more than wrapping applications and containers and virtual machines into an enclave to protect systems which have root access of view to all the memory and all the resources in the system from gaining a foothold into the virtual machines or containers or applications that are running under SGX. That's been a trend that's been going on for the last 10 years. I don't know why that's a thing. Yes, some of the software does bring complexity with it, but that is the price of trying to make the system secure and able to function in secure environments. Increasing security vulnerabilities. Well, I'll talk about that on the next slide. I have some information about that. But I think the first thing I would make a comment about on security vulnerabilities, most of the security vulnerabilities for Linux are coming from factors which have nothing to do with the kernel. Now, the kernel could be a stepping stone once you've gained access into the machine to exploit vulnerabilities in the kernel to gain additional resources or access to additional resources. But most of it has been coming from the application stack. We saw that with Apache struts. We've seen that with a number of the libraries. We've also seen it when people do dumb things like misconfigure the operating system and leave something open. They might leave a service port open and unprotected to the internet, which allows people to gain access. We've seen that. And we've seen simple things like somebody forgot to encrypt the file share on an Amazon system. So, yeah, we've seen that before too, and it's a very common thing to have happen. Most of it happens that way first. It's usually something dumb and you can't fix stupid. Sorry. Other than the fact that you need to put people in charge of making sure that your systems are secure before moving it over into the cloud. Now, the other thing that's been happening is because of the lockdowns, a lot of corporations have been moving things to the cloud to make it easier for their users and for their partners to access those systems. So, yeah. And then he talks about the Mythical Man month, adding people to an already... to a project makes it more likely to fail. Well, if Brian actually would read the Mythical Man month, he would find that that was actually a response from the creator of the OS 360 by the IBM engineer, who was replying to the CEO as to why are all these projects late? Why are they consistently late, go over budget? The Mythical Man month talks about that adding people to an already late project will not make it deliver faster. It will make it deliver later. That's what Mythical Man month is all about. Brian, you need to go read it because what you're trying to use it for, that's not what it says. So, yeah, it doesn't mean that systems that become more complex or have a tendency to fail. No, it has to do with I'm already late. I'm going to throw a bunch of resources on a project, and that's not going to make it come in any sooner. But anyway, I think personally that should be a critical read for most developers and most developing managers. So, yeah, but unfortunately they don't read that. But anyway, critical vulnerabilities in the Linux distributions. Now, this is published by Trend Micro. They also have a number of other studies they've done in the past year or so about not only critical but also high vulnerability and medium ones as well. And this is by distribution. So, yes, they are increasing year over year. And my contention is this might have something to do with the code, yeah, but it's probably because the code is not designed with security in mind. Red Hat has had definitely an increasing number of vulnerabilities. Now, people are going to look at that and go, oh, that's because IBM took them over. No. No, I don't think so. I think it's just because people do not care about spending the time to do security analysis on source code and then trying to lock it down. But again, the kernel is not the reason why. It is not the primary way that attackers gain access to systems. They usually follow the path of stupidity first and then go to this. But yeah, I mean, Amazon Linux, Amazon Linux 2 have also been increasing over time, and Ubuntu has decreased over time. So it is paying attention to security, and Ubuntu has been paying attention to security for the past 3 years in their design of software, and it shows. I mean, it clearly shows that they're on the downward trend. So, yeah, they kind of hit the peak in about 2018, and I think they did it. It was an Osh moment where they said, "Oh, we got to do something about this." I don't know what Red Hat is doing, whether they're approaching that moment yet or not. But yeah, I mean, clearly, if Ubuntu can reduce it, then it's got nothing to do with the size of the Linux kernel. So all person events were canceled. That's conferences have been dead for 2 years. Corporate events are dead. The virtual events have been a total and complete abject failure. Most user groups are also dead. So here, first of all, we've been in a lockdown worldwide for the past 2 years. We all know that. Many countries have not been allowing travel, and that's been killing the conferences itself. My personal experience with this has been with the RISC-V conferences. They have attempted to replace those with virtual events. Although that was interesting, and it's good to be able to participate in those events, you don't have the interaction that you would get with other users. So I agree with him on that, is that if you're going to these conferences in hopes of meeting and talking to people, which is what, it's not the presentation where the real data and information is exchanged. It's outside in the hallway in between the conferences where all that occurs. And yeah, virtual events, because most of them are pre-recorded by nature. They pre-record the message, and then they try to have online communication. I tried to ask some questions on one, and it didn't really go anywhere. The guy just got nasty and didn't want to answer any more of my questions. I think that would have maybe have been circumvented had it been face-to-face. But, yeah, it didn't seem like he really wanted to answer my questions. So, anyway, yeah, I would agree with that. Corporate events are dead, but yeah, again, we've been in lockdown. Virtual events have been abject failures. Yeah, I would agree with that. Most user groups are also dead, but again, I'm going to go back to user groups are not the way we do things anymore. The communities that are built today are virtual, and they have been for about the last 10 years, and that's been increasing. So I don't know. I mean, if you want to point to that and you say that that is the reason why things are falling apart, okay, if you say so, but I don't think so. I mean, Usenet used to be the most common way for people to flame each other in the community, so that's been gone for quite a while. So I guess if you really want to say the user groups are dead, it's probably because Usenet is dead. Google is building a Linux replacement. So first off, right off the bat, I'm going to answer that one. Google has not announced anything about what they're replacing. Currently, the attack Google is taking from all the publications they have made, go read the literature, as they've said this is an experimental OS. They're looking into it, and they're probably, yeah, sure, they're probably looking to replace something. They're probably looking to update Android and Chrome OS. Yeah, sure. But they haven't officially said that Fuchsia is the direction. Fuchsia may not be the direction. They may pick something else. Google's pretty famous at that. You know, you think you're going to be able to follow them, and all of a sudden they turn on a dime on you. So don't bet on Fuchsia being the actual replacement for Android and Chrome OS until they officially say that it is. Because I'm sure, like IBM, they have competing products internally that are trying to compete for that replacement. So, and then he talks about it's able to run Linux binaries, and he's answering the comments that people have had. Well, that's going to improve things for Linux. No, probably not. And he's probably right about that. Those transition technologies are meant to bring people over to the platform and then get them to use the new stuff while they're still able to use their old. I mean, it is all about the application after all. And they would bet on the fact that I'll bring you over, I'll get you using the platform, and then I'll expose you to better applications than what you're running, and then get you to migrate. Or better yet, get the developers to migrate their application into native Fuchsia code or whatever. Android and Chrome OS definitely provide the largest market share for Linux. Definitely. No doubt about that. Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, if you look at, but I would say the market share even for the server market is pretty huge too. But it's just, no, you can't compete with several billion phones that are running Android. Yeah, I don't know why you would even do that. But anyway, no operating system is dominant forever, and he looks at CP/M and DOS and Windows 3X through 9X. That was the original Windows under DOS. So yeah, Mac OS, the original Mac OS operating system but that's true of any software package. Pick anything you want, whether that be Multiplan or Lotus 123 or DBase, or I mean, you can pick any one of those platforms, and none of those are dominant today. And now SQL, the traditional SQL environments have been declining too. I mean, if you look at the market share that Oracle had 20 years ago as compared to today, I think you'll find it much less. So yeah, I mean, so what? That's software. I mean, software has a lifespan. That's all that's saying. Big deal. And Linux has had an unusually long run. Well, 30 years is about the lifetime of most operating systems, and except for Windows. I don't know, Windows should have been dead 20 years ago, but they somehow keep flying. Well, maybe I should say 10 years ago. Windows should have been dead, but Microsoft is unwilling to replace it. The problem that you have with operating systems is that they bring along their own weight of trying to maintain backward compatibility with everything. Nobody wants to replace an operating system because that means that you as a user have to reinvest in new applications. That's the reason why we have these transition environments, is because the biggest barrier getting someone to accept the use of a new operating system is the killer app. So what's the reason why you would want to use Linux over Windows, or what's the reason you'd want to use Mac OS over Windows, or why would you use Windows over Linux or Mac OS? It's always about the application, not about the fact that Linux is 30 years old. That hasn't got nothing to do with it. So yeah, that's all I have on that one. So in short, he talked about the founders being banned. My contention here is, so what? No, Linux shouldn't be contingent upon one person anyway. Otherwise, it won't survive that person's death. I mean, what if Richard Stallman or Linus or, God forbid, Eric were killed in a car accident? Then what? I mean, you shouldn't be dependent on one person anyway, especially in large communities like this. And I don't think Linux is. I don't think Linux is really dependent upon Linus. There's been over 2,000 developers that have worked on the Linux kernel over time. I think there's 335 core plus developers. That's as of a couple of years back on the last time Wikipedia was updated. But that's the most recent information I have. Companies are losing Linux focus. Well, I think that's flat wrong. More corporations moved to the cloud, and that's on Linux last year than ever before. So what? Losing focus, and the OS. I have never gone into a customer and said, "Hey, I've got Unix here. This will solve all your problems." They're going to look at me and go, "Really?" And how am I going to do my accounting? How am I going to do my general ledger? How do I produce a payroll? How do I keep inventory? How do I track sales? How do I keep my sales force engaged with the customer? They're going to ask me all kinds of application questions that have nothing to do with Unix or Linux. So operating systems have never been the focus, and if you think they are, you don't know what you're talking about. Sorry. And in the 40 years that I worked in marketing and worked for selling computers and operating systems to customers, never once has it ever been because of what operating system we were running. It's about what can you do for me? How can you make my business better? And that should be the same for you at home. How is Linux going to make you better? Is it going to make you a better employee? Is it going to help you learn? Is it going to get you branched out so that you can earn more money, for example, or whether or not it can just do simple tasks for you? Can you browse the web? Can you get online and do your banking? Whatever it is you need it to do, can that operating system do it for you? If it can't, move on. That's the way we all look at things. I personally run Linux because that's a choice. I do run some apps on Mac OS, but when Linux comes up with a way to actually do audio well, I'll come back and use Linux. That's my opinion. So Google is building a replacement for Linux. They haven't said that, so I don't know where that is even coming from. Google is working on Fuchsia, yes, but that is not Linux. No, it doesn't have any Linux code in it. It's based on Magenta kernel. But probably if they do choose Fuchsia, I'm sure it will be used to replace Android and Chrome OS. Yeah, that would make sense. They're going to want to use a single way of developing code on both platforms. That's what, in order to be able to make it less costly to them to do so. That's just normal business thinking. He thinks that Linux is statistically unlikely to stay active much longer. I think he means historically, not statistically. Operating systems have a life, and historically over time, we get bored, we're not interested, it's too inefficient, it's too crumbly, we don't like it, and something will compel us to move away from our platforms. Is Linux to that point yet? No, I don't think so. At least not for me. It might be for you. The question is, if the corporations take it over and try to turn it into a, you pay as you go license, well, screw that. I'll hop ship on Linux tomorrow. I'm a big fan of free and open source. I just think that is the way to go. We lived through all that, pay for this, pay for that software years ago, and all we ended up with is everybody was suing each other over what, and doing litigation over copyrights and patents. So, and that's still going on. So what are we going to do? This is what Brian says: get off Linux or fix it. But where are you going to go? So if you get off Linux, where are you going? You're going to go to Windows? That's a 40-year-old technology. You're going to go to BSD? That's as old as Linux. You're going to, a little slightly younger than Linux. I mean, slightly, like 1 year less, but yeah, it's still pretty old. Mac OS, 50-year-old technology. It's based on Unix. Haiku, based on BEOS, almost as old as Linux is. Fuchsia is not a replacement for Linux. It's based on the Magenta kernel. Yeah, it runs compatibility binaries, but how well, we don't know. How well does it actually work? What is it? Will it handle your GUIs? Will it translate the X Windows calls? Or will it do that? So, and then the other option is to fix Linux. Well, yeah, you're talking a major undertaking here. I think there's something, we can go run the SLOC, but I think there's something like $6.9 billion of development effort wrapped up into Linux. I'm trying to think, who in the hell would spend that much money to fix Linux? Would you rewrite it from the ground up? Would you refactor parts of it? The real problem in Linux, as far as the code complexity is concerned, is the drivers that are built into it. So, that's where the code base sits. If you look at the actual Linux code proper, there's less than 250,000 lines of code there. If you look at all the other functions around it, the file systems and all that, yeah, that adds up too. But there's 14 million lines of code right now in just drivers out of the 21. So definitely, yeah, definitely 2/3 of Linux is driver code. So to fix Linux, to make it more streamlined, yeah, you could do it, but uh, I think it would be, I think it would be easier to start over, honestly. And then you have the problem of how do you get things converted over from Linux to this new environment. Fuchsia has a solution for that. I don't think anyone in the Linux community is talking about it. Typically, operating system companies and organizations that work on a specific operating system, they don't entertain it. They'll never. If there's a change that occurs to Linux, it won't come from the Linux Foundation. It won't come from Linus. That just is very unlikely that they would even entertain that. And in fact, I bet if I asked Linus, if I wrote him a note and said, "Hey, Linus, you ever think about just rewriting Linux from scratch?" He'd probably say, "No. Are you nuts?" Um, anyway, so summary: Linux isn't going away. Here's the facts. Linux operates 90% of the cloud workloads today. Linux also operates 82% of the smartphones in the world today. Linux operates 99% of the world's supercomputers. Now, when I'm saying 82% of the smartphones, I don't mean that it's running Linux OS. I mean that it's running Android, which is a Linux kernel. And 99% of the world's supercomputers are running on Linux. So where are you going to go? That's the question. Where are you going to go? Corporations owning the Linux ecosystem, that was never the intent of free software, free and open source software. That was never the intent. In fact, the whole, I mean, if you were to go back and listen to Stallman's original design criteria for free and open source, it was just the opposite, because he didn't trust what corporations would do to you if they owned your environment. Typically, they will lock it down. They'll make it intellectual property. They won't let you look at the code. You're not allowed to learn anything from it. You can't modify it. That's the corporate world. I mean, we've seen that in hardware today as well. So, yeah, I mean, that was never the intent of the Linux ecosystem. Complexity always continues to increase over time with any software project. I mean, pick one. Doesn't matter. Even Windows has grown, I think, 60 million lines of code plus now, maybe even higher than that. Hard to say, since we aren't allowed to look at it, but some of the guesses that people have made are upwards of 50 million. So, yeah, that's just going to keep happening. Now, security vulnerabilities, those will increase because the Linux platform is a profitable target. You can see that 90% of the workloads are up on the cloud. If you were an attacker, where would you go? Who would you attack? You would look for vulnerabilities in the most likely target to be successful for you. So, I mean, that's a fact. And that's the reason why Windows has a lot of discoveries with vulnerabilities, is because it's square in the sights of a lot of these attacks. And Linux is there now, too, because it's a popular workload to be used. Most of the Linux attacks come from the application stack and not from the kernel. We saw that with, like I said, several of them using Apache's struts to gain access to different things. Other popular breaches have just been done because someone misconfigured the system and did not apply good security practices to it. Just leave something wide open, and yeah, you'll probably have a visitor. Exposing services on the internet, opening up file shares and leaving them wide open, not encrypting them. Exposed and unprotected APIs is also a good way. I remember back a few years ago when I was working on e-commerce systems, we were able to expose the API on the payment server. Not a thing you would want to have happen. So, yeah, not a thing you would want to have happen. The other thing is that one of the other attacks that have occurred is gaining access to corporate source code because of these online tools which allow them to look for security vulnerabilities in published code to examine that code online has been used to extract and download that source code. So, yeah, I mean, it's not coming from the kernel. But again, that doesn't mean the kernel can't be a vulnerability. It can, but typically there has to be a way in first, to gain access to the keyboard. So that is pretty much all I had today. So I hope you enjoyed this. I think all in all, Brian has some really good points that he's made about the viability of Linux long term. Can't argue with some of them at all. But, as far as about complexity alone in Linux, that's not new. I mean, Mac OS is gaining complexity too, and so is Windows. That's the nature of the way things work, and it's not until somebody says, stop, let's refactor this, let's rewrite this, that ever comes back down to an efficient core again. Fuchsia right now, in the last source code count I did, is less than 500,000 lines of code. So, yeah, it's pretty small, but it will grow with time. You watch. even I don't know how far Fuchsia will go. Would I go to BSD or would I go to Haiku? Haiku is not finished. So no, when we go to Haiku, BSD, maybe. Their idea of open source is a lot different than Linux. So would I go back over there? Yeah, it might. If Linux were to just fall apart and completely go into disarray, yeah, I'd probably go back over there first. But that's a different environment. That's to me going backwards. I would rather see something more modern, and I wish that the Linux people would. I know this won't happen; it never has. I mean, people that are incumbents and write operating systems, they usually aren't concerned with improving themselves. They're just trying to keep their head above water, trying to maintain the system they have, and I think that's where Linux is right now. So yeah, and Brian talks about being chased down the hill by a boulder that eventually will crush us. He might be right about that. We'll see a year from now what happens, but he might be right about that. I won't say that I haven't seen that in the past, because I have. I mean, see, are you using Lotus 1-2-3 anymore? I mean, Microsoft Excel came right out of the blue and wiped them off the map. That usually is what happens, and the same will happen with operating systems, provided that there is a killer app to drive it. I mean, the reason why the Mac OS even bothered to gain market share was because of desktop publishing. I mean, that was the thing, and that was the reason for a lot of people moving over to the Mac from Windows, because Windows didn't have that application until much later. There was also the internet window. Microsoft dragged their feet getting onto the internet, and that really brought Linux into the forefront. I think if they had jumped on it, Linux probably wouldn't be there today, but they're probably trying to figure out a way to get back in. They've got their solution set, and they're trying to push on us the Office 365 and also the new Windows desktop that they're trying to push into corporate environments that have basically the virtual desktop interface, or VDI. So I don't know. We'll see over time what happens. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, like and subscribe. Hope to see you all again real soon. And as always, bye for now.